Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about political apathy and why it's a problem. How do we measure political apathy? Which citizens tend to be more apathetic? In what ways does political apathy manifest? Why are some voters apathetic? And why does political apathy pose such a threat, including unintentionally contributing to our nation's polarization? All this and more is on tap for today's podcast. But first, today is the 50th episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. Hooray! Pew, 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 pew. Shots, shots, shots. Thank you all for being on this journey by contributing your viewership slash listenership and sharing this podcast with others you know. Please continue to do so. And thank you to all the guests I've had on this podcast so far. I think this is an especially good choice to cover for a milestone episode of this podcast. This political apathy is something I have particular concerns about in my work because today's political climate and discourse struggle with polarization and toxicity. But there's another major issue that affects our ability to find real solutions to our nation's problems, and that's political apathy. While there are many people that are too invested to the point where their political views become their identity and any difference in opinion is perceived as an existential threat, there are also people who, for various reasons, choose to rarely or never engage with politics at all. They, a lot of times, just don't care. And this political apathy can unintentionally exacerbate the problems we see today in politics, including polarization. And political apathy is a major concern of mine in my work in politics. In some ways, people are responsible for how much they should be invested in politics. And sometimes the rationale for choosing not to engage with politics is a cop out. I've heard some pretty ridiculous reasons for people saying why they don't vote or otherwise get involved in politics. But there are also understandable reasons for people to or that people have to distance themselves from politics as well. And we need to fully understand said reasons to help fix our political discourse because political apathy unintentionally contributes to a lot of the problems we see today with polarization and toxicity in particular. So today we're going to go ahead and dive into all things political apathy and how we can address these problems. So let's go. First of all, we need to actually define and measure voter apathy in some way. Defining apathy is, I've talked about it in previous episodes when it comes to defining things, or the fancy way to describe it in academic terms is operationalize. Is you need to have some idea of a term needs to be sort of somewhat agreed upon to actually define it, to know what we're talking about. I can't quite give you a full on, there's no one true definition of apathy. I'm going to use the phrase politically apathetic or just apathetic to describe this. And some political observers may call politically apathetic people passive citizens. There's no one true definition, but for our purposes, this is just generally going to describe people who, for one reason or another, do not engage much with politics. Maybe they think politics is boring or unimportant. It's not boring, it's not unimportant, but a lot of people think it is. Or they might otherwise be interested in politics or think it is important, but they feel the political system doesn't work for people like them. They feel it's a waste of their time because they just can't have some sort of impact. And we're going to get into those reasons some more, but there are several different ways to gauge how much citizens care about politics. And when you're trying to measure it, some of these reasons, it might look like it's apathy where they just don't care, but it might be due to other circumstances too. A lot of times though, it is an indication that voters don't care much or at all. And I'll describe some of these possibilities where it might not actually be a matter of apathy, but it still functionally is apathy. And a lot of times it is a lack of caring. but it's not really trying to blame people here. To some extent, it is their responsibility to care about politics, but there is also, again, some understandable reasons people have for not wanting to engage in politics, and we need to address those. But also want to make clear that there are some levels of apathy. It's not just simply, I care about politics versus I don't care about politics. They might care about only specific parts of politics or only certain elections. They might care just about voting, but they don't otherwise get involved in campaigns or consume a whole lot of political media. Or they might do those things, but only for specific elections. Or there could be some life circumstances that lessen how much somebody cares about a an election or some other political event at a particular point in time. So some of it can just be a matter of timing as well. So it gets a little bit more complicated, but we're going to try to make this as simple as possible to understand. So, some of the ways that we measure political apathy. One way, probably the easiest way to measure it is when we look at voter turnout rates. Lower voter turnout rate suggests that people are more apathetic. People who are apathetic about politics are probably not going to show up to vote. It's the most basic way people can get involved. All you have to do is just go to a polling place, as long as you're registered to vote, and cast your ballot, and then you're done. You technically don't even really need to research anything. Obviously you should research things, but you technically don't even need to do that. But you also have different rates of turnout depending on the race. Presidential elections are going to get the highest rates of turnout, and then midterms will get less than that, and then odd year elections will get less than that. And then that's not even counting primaries. A lot of local elections have elections in months that are not November. They might be in April or May or June where the election is decided then. Most voters just care about the presidential election. They think that that's the only one that matters, or that's the only one they're actually willing to get invested in. But they don't care about midterms or odd year elections or primaries and so on. And even within the same election, races lower on the ballot will see much fewer votes being cast. This is what we call ballot drop off. So if you have like 20 different things that you're voting on, you might vote on the first 5, 10, but then the last 10 elections or races that are on the ballot are going to have a lot fewer people deciding on them, even if they voted on things at the top. So, and then that's typically local races like mayor or city council, and also races that are for offices with a specified responsibility, like a local judge or a school board, might not be seen as important to certain voters. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that might be the case in a little bit. But how might this not be apathy, but still mistaken as such? Now, in fairness, when it comes to primaries, some states use what's called a closed primary, where independents cannot vote in them, and people that are registered with that party can vote in that election. So if it's a Republican primary that's closed, only Republicans can vote in it. If it's a Democratic primary that's closed, only Democrats can vote in it. So if third parties don't have a primary, well, too bad, they can't vote in that. Independents who have no party at all can't vote in any of those primaries unless it's for a nonpartisan race. So that's not necessarily a matter of not caring. That's a matter of they can't actually vote if we're talking about a primary. There might be extenuating circumstances that might have stopped someone from going to vote, even if they were otherwise going to. Maybe they experienced a severe health episode or negative health episode. Maybe they got in the hospital and they weren't actually able to cast a ballot for some reason. Maybe they had a lack of mode of transportation to get to a polling place. That is something that some people experience, especially in more rural areas. They might want to vote, but are otherwise prevented from doing so, not because of physical health problems, but maybe they're not a US citizen, or they are, in some cases, if you're a convicted felon or an ex-felon who has not had their ability to vote reinstated, you can't vote either. Now, that's a whole other topic of discussion. Not going to get into that. But whether that's right or wrong, those people cannot go to vote because they haven't had their right to vote reinstated. Another way to measure voter apathy or political apathy is that there are oftentimes low rates of other forms of political participation beyond voting. People who are apathetic are not likely to participate in politics beyond voting. It might already be a chore for them to even go to vote, but not going to expect them to get involved in other ways, like, for example, volunteering for campaigns by going door to door, knocking on people's doors and telling them about, hey, vote for this person because of XYZ reasons, or doing phone banking for that candidate. A whole bunch of other ways that you can get involved. Maybe you're not involved with a specific campaign, but you could be doing other civics oriented functions like teaching people about what's coming up in an election or going to town halls. People who are apathetic are probably not doing those things. Nonpartisan groups with different reasons for getting involved, like trying to bridge political divides. People who are apathetic, probably not doing that either. Now, if they're not participating in politics beyond voting, there might be some reasons why that's not actually apathy, but it looks like apathy. Maybe people want to get involved, but the actual opportunities are limited, or they don't believe that groups or people where opportunities are available are worth that effort. Maybe they see some of these candidates that are running for some sort of local office. They look at all of them and they're like, I don't like any of these people. I don't want to get involved. I mean, I want to get involved, but I don't like these people that are doing it. It's not a matter of apathy. It's just that what they see, they do not like. Or they don't know about the opportunities to get involved in politics because they haven't heard about them. Maybe they just haven't been educated about them. Maybe their capacity to receive this information is limited. Maybe they have poor internet connection. Broadband connections are, especially in rural areas, not the best. Maybe don't see it on TV. Maybe they don't receive mailers. Who knows? But in any case, generally speaking, if they're not getting involved in politics beyond voting, there's probably a certain level of apathy there. Another way to measure voter apathy is by looking at rates of political media consumption. People who are apathetic are likely not consuming much political media, if at all. So TV, radio, internet, particularly social media. And if they do consume political media, it's probably only going to be around the time of an election. So 1, 2, 3 months before an election, maybe then they'll start to pay a little bit of attention, but they don't really care all that much. Now, this might not actually be apathy in some cases. Some people might just be wary and distrusting of political media and just don't know where to get quality information. So they just tune a lot of things out. Their access to this quality info may be limited. Maybe they lack good internet connection, or there's no major newspaper that services them, or even a smaller newspaper that might not be available, especially as newspapers have declined in prominence over the past couple decades in particular. Or they may want to consume political media, but they also have so many other interests that they get pulled in all these other directions and thus have little time for political info. But generally speaking, a lot of times it is a matter of apathy when people do not consume any sort of political media. And it doesn't have to be Fox News and CNN and MSNBC and all that. It could be actually trying to research what's going on in politics at that time, or going on to actually educational forums like, or websites like Ballotpedia, for example. So a lot of times it is just a matter of being apathetic. Another way we can measure political apathy is by measuring the levels of knowledge about politics. People who are apathetic are likely to be much less knowledgeable about politics. They might not even know basic information like what are the three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. And then what they do: executive enforces laws, legislative writes laws, judicial branch interprets laws. They might not know who our prominent political figures are. They might not know who their local congressperson is or their state legislator. If you ever watched, like, for example, if you ever watched The Tonight Show with when Jay Leno was still hosting it, he had this segment called Jaywalking, and you could see how little some of those people knew about politics. Now, some of that probably wasn't real, but those kinds of people do exist in real life, and some of those people are going to be legit, where they just really don't know anything that's going on or know very little about political history. Now, how might this not be apathy but mistaken as such? Maybe these people do want to know more about politics, but they just don't know where to start. Maybe they didn't have a good civics curriculum where they grew up, and post school civics programs are just basically non existent or of poor quality. A lot of times we don't really focus on, I mean, there's a lot that's made about civics curricula in schools, which is good. We should care about those. But a lot of times we don't think hard enough about what comes after school. So sometimes called continuing education or adult education. We don't oftentimes focus enough on civics in that regard. So maybe these people do want to know more, but they just don't know where to start. And then some people, a lot of people, grossly overestimate how much they know about politics. But they do care about it. They just think they know more than they actually do. And it turns out, if they actually take a test, they don't really know a whole lot about it, but they still might care. But generally speaking, though, a lot of people who are lacking in knowledge about politics are just apathetic about politics. And then one more way we'll talk about, and these are not all necessarily all the ways that apathy can be measured, but there's some of the big ways, is we can look at polling questions. You might be able to gauge the apathy of voters directly or indirectly through polling questions. You're probably not going to just say, hey, are you apathetic about politics? That's probably not a good polling question. But you have to be wary, though, because people's reporting of their involvement or interest in politics can be overstated. They might not actually care about politics, but they often care about how other people perceive their involvement in politics. And we have what we call a social desirability bias, which is sometimes people change their responses to a question on a survey because they're afraid of how they're going to look to the person asking the question. They might be afraid, oh, what if how I answer this comes back to me and people know, even though you're not going to be identified on these surveys, but you might still think the person who is surveying you is going to have a negative opinion about you. So you might change your answer on a question. So when it comes to being involved in politics, there is that whole voting and being involved in politics, but especially when it comes to voting, is treated as a civic duty and responsibility, not just as a right. So when people are being polled about how involved they are in politics, they might overstate how involved they are. And one particular way that this is seen a lot of times is in public opinion surveys. Overall self-reporting of people voting tends to be noticeably higher than the actual voter turnout rate in an election. So if you poll a specific state about how many of those voters voted in the previous election, you'll probably get something like, I'm just going to make up some numbers, but just to demonstrate, you might get like 70% of people say, oh yeah, I voted in the last election, when really it was more like 55%, because of that whole, I don't want people to think that I don't vote because I don't want people looking down on me. So you have that bit of an issue. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't regard what public opinion surveys, what polling questions say, but it is something to think about and to watch out for. And then for campaigns in particular, and not even necessarily campaigns, but these big polling organizations that also are trying to figure out what's going to happen in an election, they have what's called a likely voter. So that's not a specific formula that anybody can employ. It's a proprietary thing. A lot of these organizations have their own formula for determining how likely somebody is to vote. So you're never going to actually see what that formula is because it's proprietary. So then when it comes to things being proprietary and copyrighted, that's when legal ramifications come in. Uh, so it's not an exact science, but oftentimes polls will ask questions along the lines of how excited are you to vote in this election, or how much are you looking forward to this election, or how interested are you in this year's election. So again, people might inflate how eager they are as part of that social desirability bias. They might think, "Oh, I need to really sell to this person. Oh, I'm really excited to vote," even though they really couldn't care less. They just care about how they're being perceived. But there might be people who do legitimately answer how much they are looking forward to voting, but it might just be for that particular moment in time that they were polled, and then that could change. So if you're polled 2 months before an election and some major controversy happened with one of the major candidates, candidate A said something incredibly stupid and offensive, at that point you might be fired up and be like, "Oh, I can't let this person win. I'm going to make sure that they lose." But then another month rolls around and you've already forgotten about what they said, or you haven't forgotten about what they said, but you've cooled off a bit now and are like, yeah, I mean, I don't like what he said, but am I really going to go and vote? Some people have that kind of thing to consider in their brain. It's not an exact science, but those are just some ways to at least try to get a sense of how apathetic they are. And those are usually pretty good indications, but you do have to watch out for other extenuating circumstances that actually indicate maybe they're not apathetic, but it just looks like apathy. But a lot of times it is still apathy. So, moving on from how to measure voter apathy, now let's talk about who exactly tends to be more apathetic. Because there is a little bit of science to that too. There are certain groups of people, certain kinds of characteristics that you can look at to say, okay, this person's probably going to be more apathetic, or at least they're more likely to be apathetic about politics. So if we go back to our measurements we just discussed, voters who tend to be more apathetic tend to exhibit traits like voting much less often, if at all. They rarely, if ever, participate in politics beyond voting. They consume little to no political media, and if they do consume it, it's probably only going to be close to election time. They have low levels of political knowledge, things like that. Now, if we look at other characteristics, we can say, for example, if we look at the partisan leanings of people, we have a lot of times we have a conception that we call a quote unquote weak Democrat or Republican and a strong Democrat or Republican. It's not a value judgment, it's just a description of how closely tied that person feels to that party label. So if they are strongly Democratic or Republican, they care a lot about the fact that they're a Democrat or a Republican, and they're probably going to let you know that they're Democrat or Republican. So when it comes to voter apathy, in terms of partisan leanings, usually the more apathetic people are quote unquote weak Democrats or Republicans, or what you might call a quote unquote true independent, where it's not somebody who leans towards one party, but they are really just middle of the road. Those kinds of voters tend to be more apathetic. And that's because they have no strong pull towards a party, so campaign appeals to those party labels aren't effective. They don't excite them. You can't go to them and be like, "You got to be a good Democrat. You've got to be a good Republican and turn out for our candidate." Those people are not going to care about that. And it's a similar thing with ideological leanings. So people who tend to be, quote unquote, somewhat liberal or conservative versus being strongly liberal or conservative, or what we might call a quote unquote true moderate. Similar to party, these appeals to ideological labels don't really have much pull on these kinds of people. They tend to be more apathetic. They don't really have a strong tie to any particular labels. And then if you look at some other social demographics, ones that tend to be more apathetic include younger people, some racial minorities, less educated people, lower income, and some of the reasons for that. And then again, this is not a value judgment on any of those people. This is just trying to describe why some of those people tend to be apathetic. For younger voters, they oftentimes are less mature, although, believe me, I've seen some older people that are not mature at all. Uh, but they also just have less experience with the real world to suggest that they should care more about politics. They don't experience, there's not a lot of experiences that they've had where some sort of policy issues, like obviously if they're younger, they're not going to be getting Social Security. So they're not going to care. That's one less thing for them to care about, or Medicare or any sort of other elderly policies. It's probably not going to have as much of an impact. So they're going to think that there's less reason for them to be involved, or it's just plain they haven't had time to really learn enough about politics, so they don't really think about it a whole lot. When it comes to racial minorities, and this can vary considerably because there's obviously a lot of different racial groupings that we can talk about. But for some racial minorities, there is research to suggest that they feel much more represented when they have government officials like Congress people that have a similar racial background to them. So sometimes that makes them more invested. A lot of times, Congress in particular gets chastised for not being demographically representative. And so for some racial minorities, if they don't have a whole lot of people from their racial background in office, they oftentimes feel less represented. They don't feel that issues important to them are being talked about. So that sometimes makes them apathetic and just goes, okay, I guess we're just not going to have anybody that cares about what our racial groupings are going through. Obviously, that's not the case for everybody. And I realize as a white person how that can come across. So I'm trying to make sure I say this in a way that hopefully makes sense of hopefully what I'm saying makes sense and doesn't come across as anything in particular. But that is, for some racial minorities, that is part of the equation. There's also the less educated demographic. They don't know what they don't know. So a lot of times they don't know that they should care about politics, or they don't know what the issues are. They don't have a civics background. And a lot of times, more civically minded people are more invested in politics. And they just have less exposure to political info. So there is therefore, people who have lower levels of education tend to be less, or they tend to be more politically apathetic. And then when it comes to lower income voters, they a lot of times are just so focused on their current economic situation. They're just not even worried about anything else. They're just worried about the next paycheck and being able to feed their families. They oftentimes believe that officials are just there to enrich themselves at voters' expense, and they oftentimes just don't have the fiscal means to influence politics like a lot of these major political donors do, or even not even major political donors, but regular political donors, the ones that you don't necessarily hear about as much, but still make regular contributions to state level campaigns or local level campaigns. Maybe they give like $500 regularly or $1,000 regularly, not like these mega donors that you often hear about. And of course, all these demographics can work in tandem to make somebody more or less apathetic as well. Maybe it's a young person who is also a racial minority who is lower income, or maybe it's somebody who is a more educated person that is younger. All these things can work together to make somebody more or less politically apathetic. But of course, people are people, individuals have their own reasons for things. So that's not to say that older people can't be politically apathetic, whiter people can't be politically apathetic, more educated, higher income. But generally speaking, with these demographics, these are the demographics that tend to be more politically apathetic. And sometimes the reasons are understandable. Now we know who is apathetic or who tends to be more apathetic. Now we need to think about and talk about why some people are more apathetic. And touched on that a little bit already with some of the discussion about who tends to be more apathetic, but let's go into it some more. So, when you dive into why people are apathetic, just simply saying, well, why don't you care about politics? You should care. What's wrong with you? That's for a lot of people, that's not going to convince them to actually get involved in politics, and certainly not to actually educate themselves on what's going on. You need to effectively demonstrate to people why they should care about politics. Otherwise, you can't actually fix political apathy. But before that, we need to know why people don't care about politics in the first place. If you don't know why they don't care about politics, you can't address that specific reason for why they can't or don't care about politics in the first place. So, one reason that people are politically apathetic is when it comes to low levels of political efficacy. Now, there are two types of political efficacy. We actually had an episode that centered on political efficacy. I want to say it was episode 28. But there are two types, internal and external. Internal relates to how much people know about politics and how much they think they know about politics. And an external political efficacy refers to how much people can impact politics and how much they think they can impact it. So there can be some discrepancy between how much people think they know about politics and how much they actually know and how much they impact politics and how much they think they impact politics. But generally speaking, those are the two basic groups of political efficacy. And apathetic voters tend to demonstrate low levels of efficacy. They do not know much about politics and or think they don't understand it. Maybe they actually do know about politics, but they perceive that they don't really know. And so they might think, I don't think I should get involved because I don't really understand all this stuff. And politics is very complicated. It's complicated for all of us. Just like even for me, just because we're involved in politics for a living doesn't mean that we've figured out everything. Of course not. No, nobody has everything figured out. Doesn't stop some people from acting like they've got everything figured out, but I digress on that point. Or apathetic voters tend to have low levels of efficacy because they do not sometimes because they do not have many avenues to affect politics and or think they can't make an impact on politics. Last week, I had talked with two very well-educated, well-spoken young men, Graham Bernstein and Jacob Kaplan from the Florida Student Policy Forum, and they talked a lot about young people making an impact when it comes to legislative advocacy. These are definitely two guys who have high levels of political efficacy, and they want other young people to have that level of political efficacy as well. But it just shows you that divide that some people have when it comes to political efficacy and how much people think they can make a difference. Because there's a lot of young people that think that they can't affect change, and so they just don't get involved. Even if they'd really like to get involved, they just think it's a waste of time because nobody's going to listen to them. Another contributor to why some people are apathetic is the difficulty in researching info. And those of us who are involved in politics for a living, we sometimes underestimate the difficulty being informed is for non-political people. Because a lot of times it is very difficult to find political information, especially when it comes to local level races, like a school board or a mayor. It is often very difficult to find an ample amount of information about what's going on because it's just not covered as much. even for those of us who are trained in research, it can be difficult. And if it's difficult for somebody like me or somebody else who is trained in this kind of thing, if it's difficult for us to find information, it's really hard to expect other people to be able to devote time to trying to find this information either, especially because they have their work is in something that's not political, so then they'd have to spend the time to also learn about politics. That's a tough ask for people. And even if you know where to find info, it takes time and effort to find that info, especially when it comes to quality info. There's a lot of bad information out there, a lot of polarized, heavily biased information, which unfortunately is much easier to find than actually quality info. And so that's partly what makes this bad, crappy info circulate so much faster, is because it just is so much easier to find. And social media algorithms cater to that. Time and effort are finite for everybody, especially when our other interests and the demands of life cut into our attention too. And I'll use me as an example. Obviously, politics is what I do for a living. I don't like focused on politics 24/7, though. I have plenty of other interests. I enjoy sports, football, basketball, baseball, hockey. I'm starting to get more back more into baseball. Uh, Video games is another major interest of mine. So those things are cutting into my attention too. And that's me as somebody who's involved in politics for a living. Now you're talking about people who are not involved in politics for a living, having to also cut or put aside some time to get more informed about politics. It's it's a lot to ask of people. And it also might even cost money to get that information. Like if you're subscribing to a national newspaper like that has a paywall, like Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, for example. Well, Bloomberg's not a newspaper, but you get the point. It's a news source that has a paywall. And this contributes to apathy because this difficulty in researching info makes many people just throw up their hands in defeat, because it's just like, well, what's the point of this? I don't know where to find this information. I don't know whether it's good information. What's even the point? They might really want to get involved and informed, but there's just so many roadblocks to becoming informed. And so people sometimes become apathetic and just like, you know what? I'm not even going to bother. Another reason that people can be apathetic is just a general disenchantment with politics. And hey, you know what? Honestly, sometimes it's something I struggle with too. Sometimes I'm just like, oh gosh, what's the point of all this? And for a lot of people, they feel the same way, and they're not even involved in politics the way I am or other people are. And this disenchantment can be for a number of reasons. Maybe they just think that politics doesn't and won't ever work for them, no matter what they do. Maybe they're turned off by the level of polarization in politics and want to distance themselves from that. Maybe they're flustered at how complicated it all seems and is. Talked about the difficulty in researching info. Maybe they're just so frustrated at trying to figure out who to trust that they just tune it all out. Maybe they say, Democrats, no thank you. Republicans, please move out of the way. Independents, I don't even know anything about them. They just sometimes are just frustrated that all the stimuli that's bombarding them, bombarding their brains all the time, and they just go, you know what? I'm just going to cut this out. What's even the point of all this? It's just too much stuff to take in. Whatever the reason, disillusionment leads many people to become apathetic. If you're disillusioned, you're just going to say, I don't care, which is what apathy is. You don't care. It's not that they want to be apathetic. In fact, many of them don't want to be apathetic. It's just the disillusionment, the disenchantment is sometimes just too much. Another reason that people can be apathetic, politically apathetic, is they don't think that politics affects them, especially when you get to the more esoteric local level offices. For example, some people do not care about school boards because they do not have kids and they have been far removed from schooling themselves. They might have moved somewhere that they didn't grow up in, so they didn't grow up in that educational system, and so they don't get involved in it. Maybe because they just don't think it's appropriate for them to, because they don't really know what's going on. But some people just are like, oh, I don't have kids. Why am I even going to bother with the school board? Some people care about the higher levels of government, but they don't think the lower level stuff matters. And so they participate much more in those federal level or maybe even state level races, but they don't participate in the local level. And then state level has less participation than federal level. And they might think that the federal government handles a lot more things than it actually does. Some people will request that the president, whoever it is, do something that they have absolutely no power over. And even if they could do something about it, there's a billion other things that are taking that president's attention that they're really not going to be worried about that local matter anyways. But as crazy as that may sound to some of us, there are some people, including registered voters, who just don't think politics at all are that important. Not because of disenchantment or frustration or anything like that. They just do not care, do not want to care, and do not think they should care. And if they don't think politics matters, obviously they're likely to be more apathetic. I mean, that probably goes without saying. But they if somebody doesn't think something affects them, they're not gonna really worry about it, more than likely. Another reason that some people are apathetic is that they perceive a lack of representation in government. And there are various ways that people don't think politicians represent them. I mentioned earlier, for some racial minorities, they often don't think elected officials look out for them or their communities, and in part because they don't see as many people that look like them. Some people might think more along ideological or partisan lines where they think that politicians are too liberal or conservative. Even if they are also liberal or conservative voters, they might think that some politicians are just too far out there, and they're like, you know what, I'm not that far there. So I'm just not going to bother with them. And it's the same thing with partisanship. Some people may be Democrat or Republican, but they think somebody who's all the people that are in office are like, oh, I'm not that Republican, I'm not that Democratic, so they might not they might be apathetic about government that way. And then younger people often perceive politics as being just old people. And yes, government does much more skew older, and people that regularly vote tend to be older. So younger people often just see these politicians as just not caring about younger people's issues at all. You might hear them actually say that politics is just a bunch of old white guys, which is not true, but there is a skew to that in the representation of government. So apathetic people often think that politicians don't represent them and thus aren't going to get invested in politics. This person doesn't represent me, so why am I even going to bother? They'll a lot of times think. The whole point of elected officials are that they are supposed to represent you to some extent. Now, to what extent they should be representing you and how much they should be doing specifically what you want, that's up for debate. That's a whole other can of worms. But in any case, people in office are supposed to represent you to some extent. And then the last piece we'll cover for the reasons why voters are apathetic is that they're not being surrounded by other civically minded individuals. A lot of political scholarship focuses on the role of family, friends, peers in political socialization, which just refers to the development of political opinions, values, and beliefs over your lifetime. And these social influences can and often do have a monumental impact on your sense of civic duty and your general political views, especially when you filter it through social media. And even though those are technically not your peers, or a lot of times you just see somebody online, these, as much as I hate this term, influencers can take the role of peers even when they aren't actually peers, especially these very biased, one sided influencers that just think they know everything about what's going on and that you need to think like them. Otherwise, you're a goofball. You're dumb. But I digress on that point. But you also see these influences of civic mindedness or a lack of civic mindedness through peer pressure and social desirability bias, again from polling, groupthink, following trends. We are, even those of us who like to think that we're not so susceptible to peer pressure, we're social creatures. We all are susceptible to some extent to social pressures. But apathetic people, or politically apathetic people, tend to have not many, if any, people around them that do care about politics, that are civic minded. So there's nobody to really reinforce to them the fact that they should care about politics, because, like, oh, well, my friends and my family didn't tell me how important it was to be involved in politics. My friends don't really care about politics. The people I see don't really get involved in politics. So why should I? That's the logic for a lot of people. Now, it's all well and good to talk about how to measure voter or political apathy and why people are apathetic. But why is political apathy such a problem? And for some people, that might seem like a question that answers itself. Like, well, yeah, what do you mean? Why is it a problem? Why wouldn't it be a problem? If you want people to not be apathetic, you have to demonstrate to them why they shouldn't be apathetic, why they should care. So you need to also demonstrate not only the benefits of them getting involved in politics in some fashion, or at least being informed, but also demonstrate the consequences of being apathetic. Because these concerns about political apathy have been around for a long, long time. It's not a new phenomenon. In fact, when I was doing research for some of my notes, I found news articles, academic journals, and so on from 50, 100, 150, 200 years ago that talk about political apathy. And the founding fathers' writings also demonstrated this worry about political apathy. They didn't necessarily use that specific word, apathy, but they talked about it in their writings on what it means to be a good citizen and the importance of an informed electorate. You see it a little bit in or a lot rather, in the Federalist Papers, which were written predominantly by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. But part of the reason why you need to demonstrate to people why they should care about politics is the need to demonstrate why their apathy is actually a problem, not just for them, but for other people, including those who do care about politics. Then you can really start fixing the problem of political apathy. But it can be a struggle to get past this roadblock and convincing them. And if it wasn't so much of a problem, well, we would already have figured out the solution. But few of the reasons why political apathy is a problem is it leads to a generally more uninformed public. There's that very cliche knowledge is power, but it is very true in the context of politics. When you are knowledgeable about what's going on, you can make a big impact on what's going on in politics. You can't affect change if you don't know what is wrong and how to even start going about fixing it. To fix it, you have to know who your elected officials are, how the government is structured, who the leaders in government are that can have the most impact on policy and legislation, so on and so forth. And also, civic knowledge has been shown academically and practically to have positive effects on democracy, the responsiveness of government, accountability in government. We need an informed public, and not even just from the fact of, from a standpoint of healthy politics, healthy democracy. It's just good to just be more knowledgeable about stuff in general, even just to have something to talk about with people. Another reason why political apathy is a problem is that it affects the people who do care about politics in a negative fashion too. Now, some of these people who care about politics, it's not always healthy. Some of them they care too much about politics and they get way too amped up. But if too many people of a particular group, whether it's geographic, like a town or a county or a state, demographic, so any of these social characteristics like age, for example, political groups, etc. If too many people of that group do not care about politics and don't participate in politics in any way, or at least at very low rates, they're not going to be listened to by government officials. Government officials have no incentive to listen to them because they're not even voting, much less getting active in campaigns and advocacy. And then the people in those groups who do care about politics will have their voice drowned out as well because their compatriots are not participating either. So then people can get frustrated not only with politicians, but people in their cohorts too. And if politicians think not enough people care, they're going to push the boundaries of what they think they can get away with. It's a human nature problem. When we think that there's no accountability, no reprisal for something, we tend to push the boundaries of what we think we can get away with. And so this leads to government that is unresponsive except to those who benefit those elected officials. People who donate a ton of money, who vote regularly, they're just going to listen to those people. So apathy leads to a lack of accountability from politicians. And then the third big reason I'm going to talk about here for why political apathy is a problem is that political apathy unintentionally contributes to polarization. And polarization is a very serious issue we have right now. Now, sometimes it can be inflated to seem like it's bigger than it is and that it's insurmountable. It's not insurmountable. It's going to be very difficult to get past it, but we can get past it. But apathy contributes to polarization because polarized people are anything but apathetic. In fact, they care too much, just like we said earlier. They perceive politics as a constant existential crisis, and they are much less willing to hold their own side accountable for anything. And so it heightens this tribalism that we often see in politics. But less polarized people tend to be more apathetic and thus less involved in politics. They vote less often, especially in non presidential elections, and they don't participate in politics much beyond voting, if they do at all. And so more and more, it just becomes polarized people being active in politics. And that makes polarization seem more pervasive than it actually is because polarized views are mostly being represented. The people who want to affect positive change but are not so heavily one-sided, their voice is getting drowned out. And so these polarized views become more influential, benefiting only a small number of people, which makes government less responsive, less accountable, less representative. And it makes our politics overall become more hostile, which drives more people away, which makes more people apathetic. And the cycle continues. It becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of polarization. So, too many people being apathetic and not caring actually can can augment the reasons that people were apathetic in the first place, thinking that government doesn't work for them, thinking the polarization is too much, and so they're just not even going to bother, not being informed about politics. Those are only going to become worse if you are apathetic. So, how do we address this voter apathy, this overall political apathy? Because you can't just tell people that they should care. We need to effectively demonstrate why they should and how they can. And there's no one size fits all approach, as people have different reasons for being apathetic. So you need to target people differently if you're trying to make them not apathetic, make them actually care. Obviously, it's not an easy thing to solve because if it was, we'd have figured out how to address it by now. Now, some people, no matter what you do, they're just going to continue to be apathetic. And you know what? That's okay to have at least a few people be apathetic because it's not reasonable to expect everyone to care. You can't just you're never going to have 100% participation. And there are some people that arguably shouldn't be participating anyways. But we do need a lot more people to care, and in a healthy manner, because some people, again, they care too much. To some extent, people, and we said this earlier, people have a responsibility to care about politics themselves. They have a duty to make themselves care. But there are also understandable reasons for why people have just given up on politics. So simply just blaming people for not caring is not only sometimes unhelpful, but the blame is sometimes misplaced. And I used to believe a lot more in this, the whole, like, if you don't vote, you don't have the right to complain. I used to think a lot like that. Now, there is a little bit to some extent where some people just want to complain for the sake of complaining. They don't actually want to fix something. In that case, yeah, I don't want to hear it. But just because people don't participate doesn't necessarily mean that they shouldn't complain. You have to know why exactly they're not participating. And sometimes this blaming is not only unhelpful, but it's sometimes misplacing the blame. So we first need to address the underlying reasons why people are politically apathetic. So is the reason for this apathy a matter of knowledge and civic understanding? So do they have low political efficacy? Is there not a good civics curriculum where they went to school? Is there a lack of a post-school civics curriculum for adult education? Is researching politics too onerous for one reason or another? How you tackle apathy based on a matter of knowledge and civic understanding might be different than if the reason for the apathy is an emotional issue. Maybe they're just frustrated, angry, and fearful about politics to the point that they're just like, well, screw this. I don't care about this. This is dumb. Why am I going to get involved in this? So how you tackle it from an emotional standpoint is different. And then maybe it's also a sociological issue. So maybe they don't have people around them that care about politics and know how to get involved. And maybe their parents didn't properly socialize them, politically socialize them. So is it a matter of knowledge? Is it an emotional issue? Is it a sociological issue? Is it a different issue entirely? How we tackle each of those reasons, it requires a bit of a different touch. And then once we do that, we need to actually tackle the root causes of political apathy, such as improving civics curricula in school and beyond. Or maybe we need to make political information much easier to find. And groups like Ballotpedia, for example, Pew Research Center, a lot of times need to just make people more aware of that information. Hopefully, they'll also come to this podcast as well. You also need to make people feel more represented in politics. Too often, people get excluded from the table. So, is it younger people that feel excluded, racial minorities, less educated, lower income? Or is it the flip side? Is it people who are higher income, who are more educated, who are not racial minorities, who are older? Do they feel excluded as well? We shouldn't be excluding anybody from the table, but we need to work in any case on making people feel represented too. If they feel represented, they're probably going to be much less apathetic. They're going to be more involved. And then simultaneously to actually addressing that underlying or those underlying reasons for political apathy, we must demonstrate why their apathy is unintentionally making things worse and why they should care about those specific things. How apathy leads to a much less responsive and accountable government because they're only listening to the people who are getting most involved. And so they just shut out people who are not paying attention, which means that politicians can further abuse our trust, our taxpayer dollars, our respect for political institutions. They can further manipulate us because if we're apathetic, we're not going to do anything about it. And then apathy also adds to polarization by letting these polarized views gain undue influence because they're the ones who aren't apathetic, and they drown out other voices that care but are not so polarized. So that further adds to this issue of a lack of representation. So it obviously there's a lot here that needs to be done to address political apathy, but it is one of our biggest issues, I think, that we have, along with this excessive level of polarization and hostility and toxicity that we see in politics. So obviously that's a lot easier said than done to address all those things, but these are just some beginning steps we need to take to actually address political apathy and to address it long term, not just a short term solution, but to actually address it long term and to make sure that people have a healthy concern about politics, not get to the point where they get angry like we see a lot of times, which can happen to any one of us. We all need to make sure that we don't get too caught up in things too. So there is a right balance to strike, and I think we can get there, but it'll take a lot of changes to how we do things and not just blaming people for being apathetic, but to demonstrate to them why they should care, why they should be less apathetic. But that is going to cover today's podcast episode. And once again, thank you all so much for listening. Man, 50 episodes. I really appreciate all of you listening and liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing. Please continue to do so we get another 50, actually a lot more than 50 is the goal. The goal was to keep this going as much as possible. So as always, thank you all for the support. Links in the show notes, my Facebook, LinkedIn, Medium profile, where I write about politics from time to time as well. Matchmaker FM profile if you want to be a guest on this podcast or you want me to be a guest on your podcast. And my educational email course that talks a little bit about this whole how do we properly address polarization, how we depolarize our political climate, how we unintentionally contribute to the polarization, and how to fix those mistakes that we make when trying to depolarize the political climate. But that is going to do it for today's episode. So as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.